Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today we're going to tackle the Space Sharks, or Carcharodons Astra, or Astra Carcharodons. I forget precisely what order the so-called High Gothic is pronounced in, but they're always going to be Space Sharks to me. Now there's a lot of different ways of doing these guys, and some folks tend to enjoy doing them really dark. I've seen some very light finishes, so this is honestly just my take on the look, It's a Space Marine, there's no right answers. So if you enjoy some of the techniques, but you don't really like the finish, you can, of course, just change the colors that you're using and get a different result. Now, these guys are a lot more grim and battered than some of the others that you will have seen me paint, and we'll get to that step very near the end, so keep your eyes open. As always, all of the paints will be listed in the description below. Let's get started.
Now, a couple of these parts on the miniature are 3D prints. So the shoulder pad, this cool chain axe he's got going, and the shark fin helmet are all off of my Mars 2 Pro. Now, of course, you could convert the chain axe, and there are decals available. Have a quick look online to see if you can find the sharked decals. But I figured I might as well use them because they are kind of cool. Now, once that's all been assembled, I've gone ahead and given it a primer spray of uniform grey from the Army Painter. I'm using that instead of Mechanica Standard Grey because we are going to do quite a bit to this grey, and it's going to end up looking quite dark by comparison. Most of the artwork I've seen, the artwork and sort of the official artwork tend to disagree a little on how dark these guys ought to be. I'm going a bit more Codex appearance for this. So uniform grey is where we're starting. Now the very first stage after that is we are going to start straight away with a dry brush. And I've got one of my little makeup brushes, and I'm going to work some rack white into my brush. And from there, I am going to start dry brushing just by flicking my little old brush very lightly against areas where I want a nice sharp edge. So you'll see this will be pretty quick and simple to do. As always, if you are having any trouble, you're leaving too much paint behind, just scrub some more of it off and start over. This is going to be a little bit chalky in some places, simply by virtue of the fact that we are dry brushing round areas in some cases, but we will get to how to fix that in a minute. Now you'll see we've got a nice sharp edge on most of our areas of detail, but if I flip them around, I'll show you one of the spots where that dry brush will normally catch a little more than you'd like, and you'll get this slight ghosting or bibbly-bobbly effect, which we are going to fix up later. But because we're going to cover some of these areas in a different color first anyway, we want to save that tidy up stage nearer to last. So for now, we're going to move on to the metal. And for this, I've got lead belcher. It's really up to you how you paint your weapons. The chainsaw in particular, is it chaos? Is it... I don't know. But lead belcher is the answer to all of your metal questions. As soon as I keep it in shot there. Now, the wonderful thing about this is going over a grey, it is going to cover beautifully. But if you do find in some areas it's a little patchy, you can come back and hit it with a second coat where you need to. Now that won't take you terribly long, and you can see I haven't been very careful when it comes to the weapon. I'm going to need to tidy this up later anyway, but for now I just want to get the silver down, and that's easy. We're going to move on. I've got here ashen-grey. We're actually going to use a couple of grey colours for this stage. First of all, we're going to paint in the undersuit and any sort of soft grey stuff, so I'm also going to paint in the weapon haft with a smaller brush for this one. But any parts of the undersuit that are visible, go ahead and ashen-grey those now. And then we're going to move to a Vallejo color. This is German grey. And if you want to stick to purely Citadel stuff, you could instead here use Corvus black. But I tend to find the coverage here is much better. So let's flip them around, and any of the hard black details, so armor plates, weapons, and what have you, I'm now just going to give a quick blast of German grey, which will dry to an almost black finish, and is really nice. Now I had a bit of fun trying to determine which bits I was going to paint that dark, almost black. There are some differing accounts based on artwork versus what's in codexes, and even what are in the Forge World books tends to change from marine to marine. So you're free to pretty much make it up. We are still painting fictional spacemen. There's not a right answer. What I'm going to use now, oh goodness me, I can't quite get this in the shot, but I have a little grey sear, and I'm going to paint this onto the really light off-white areas that we want. So I'm going to use this on this section of his helmet, and I'm also going to paint in the chapter badge with grey sear. Now this is a paint which normally needs a couple of coats to take. So take your time, lay down one layer, and do let it dry thoroughly before you try applying a second. Okay, now 3 coats of paint later, we can move on to that fabled cleanup stage. Now at this point I'm going back to uniform grey from the army painter, and I've thinned it down a little. All I'm going to do is just block out some of the areas where you'll see I have too much dry brush. So on his leg here is another good candidate for this. I'll just do a little sweep and leave some of that dry brush towards the bottom edge. Basically anywhere that you've got too much and it looks a little chalky, just hit it now with some of the base color. So if you would have primed this guy in Mechanica Standard Grey, you'd of course use that grey now instead. But really this is up to you. Now, at this stage, I'm also going to go back with some of my lead belcher again, and I'll tidy up the, what's it called? The weapon where I know I went overboard. But yeah, I'll come back in a couple of seconds once those stages are done, because we'll be ready to move on from there. Now, once you've done all of the tidy up that you want to, it's time to move on to our first shade. And no surprise here, I've got Nuln Oil. We're going to apply this generously over the whole miniature. And as always, any areas where you get big pull marks of it, you can just drag that away with your brush. So you want to make sure that you're working it into the recesses, but don't leave big blobs of it sitting on legs and what have you. Move that around while it's still wet, and you'll get rid of some of the tide marks at the same time. Now once you've gone around the whole miniature with this, we'll leave him to dry for about half an hour, and then see what this first stage looks like. Now once that's finished drying, you'll get nice deep shading, and it leaves our dry brush intact while really tying it in, and saves us having to do all of that highlighting on the grey armor. Nice, nice. What we're going to move on to now is all of the sort of other colors which are going to need an Agrax Earthshade. So for this I'm going to start off with Balthazar Gold. This is a dreadful gold color, but absolutely brilliant at brass and stuff, and the brassy finish is really what I want for these Marines. So we'll start off. I'm going to do his chest eagle, obviously, in this. I'm also going to paint in his trim on his shoulder pauldron here. Now, I'll turn him this way and show you a quick trick when it comes to pauldrons. If you're struggling to paint a straight line, don't. Turn your brush on its side, and you're almost overbrushing that layer. You'll find it much less likely that you'll tilt your brush in and end up filling in some of those areas, but you'll keep a nice straight line on your shoulder trim. Now that doesn't take very long. Mercifully, it covers brilliantly over grey. Now we're going to paint in the purity seals, and we'll start off first of all with some Rakath flesh. You could also use Xandri dust if you prefer a darker, more brown finish to your paper. Then for the wax, I'm going to turn to Mephiston Red. Now there's not really a correct colour for purity seals. I've seen people paint them all sorts of colours on the space sharks. But I think a really bright splash of colour is going to work quite well on this armour. Now, of interest to me is the fact that a lot of people tend to paint these guys with very bright equipment. So I'm using Steel Legion Drab here, and we're going to paint in all of the, what would normally be leather gear. This makes it look a little more like a sort of a treated cloth, but I quite like it. It does reinforce the darkness of the armor. So all of their pouches and what have you with this. Now once all of his equipment is brown, it's time to decide what you're going to do with his face. Now the Astra's Carcharodon or Space Shark, I'm just going to keep calling them Space Shark. It's way cooler. They're described as having ashen-grey skin, which I guess is kind of a nod to the fact, well, grey, sharks. But they have all of these trappings and names of a tribal society, Te Kahorangi being their chapter master, or I believe, and that's the name of the second largest national park in New Zealand. So you can see there's a lot of this being borrowed, and then it's another chapter which have this weird skin coloration. And it bugs me a little. Like, I'm sure there's nothing sort of sinister behind it, but it does bug me that we can't just have a Space Marine chapter which are black guys. So I've mixed up here. This is half and half Blood Reaver Flesh and Skaven Blight Dinge, because I'm going to try and get the best of both worlds here. Now, as a quick painting note, if you have trouble reaching chins and what have you, just flip your miniature upside down. I see all the time people complaining, oh, I can't reach his face when it's got, a gorget or what have you. Just flip him. And once you've got all of that done, you can flick him back around the other way. Now you'll see this is quite dark going on, and we are going to shade it so it'll be even darker. But once we've finished, we're going to have something which is kind of a cross between the ashen-grey finish that the Space Sharks are famed for, and, I do want some dark-skinned Marines for once. So let's finish this off. Now this fella does have quite prominent bionics, so once I've laid down the first layer of skin, what I'm going to do is go back with some lead belcher, and just paint in the areas that I know are going to be metal, because it's much easier to cover this over than try and avoid painting metal areas later. And once I've done this, I'm going to go back to ashen-grey, and I'm going to paint in his hair as well. Now with all of those base coats applied, we're going to get to our Agrax Earth shade at last. And I'm not going to switch up to a large shade brush for this. I want a fair bit of control for how I'm applying this. But nice and quick, all I got to do is one quick layer of Agrax over everything that we've just base coated now. Now we're starting to get somewhere. Now I'm going to switch on down to a smaller brush, and I've mixed in some Storm Vermin fur to my earlier flesh color. Now this is about equal parts of all three of them, so if you want to mix this up at home, it's up to you. Honestly, I would err now on the side of more grey. So I'm going to start by covering over most of his face in this odd grey mix, but leave the brown in the recesses. Now I think you'll start to see how that grey and skin tone is going to come together. What I'm mixing up now, this is 2 parts of Administratum Grey with 1 part of Night Questor Flesh, so we are getting quite precious about our mixes now. And I have thinned this down in order that I can use this as my final highlight on the skin. This will be quite sharp going on, but once it dries, this is going to come in a little and help finish that off. Now we've got a skin tone that ends in the ashen grey that the Space Sharks are known for, but there's still clearly dark skin underneath, and that really suits me a bit more. I'm going to highlight some of the metal areas now by turning to Iron Hand Steel, and I'm going to start first of all by doing some of the stuff on his face, but around the rim of his bolt pistol and similar. Now you'll see I haven't done much of that, just enough to bring out the depth on that face, as well as a little bit on the bolt pistol. Now for some of these areas I'm going to come back and dry brush them later, but that'll do for now, and I want a little bit more control on the face. I have now here, this is Liberator Gold, and we're going to do just a few little bips and blops on some of our gold, bronzy, brassy areas. And now let's spin him around, and we'll use a little bit of Baneblade Brown to highlight the leather. Now, for hard edges on our dark armor areas, I'm going to use Dawnstone, and just a little bit off the edge of my brush to flick in there. There we go, and get a nice sharp edge without having to worry about using the tip of my brush. Then with those hard edges done, I'm going to turn to Storm Vermin Fur and lightly highlight his hair. You could also do the undersuit, like if you want to do the ridges in the black suit under his armor, you could do that now, but I don't think it's going to make enough of a difference, rather, that it's really worth the extra work. Now I mentioned a dry brush, and this is where we're going to turn to Necron Compound. There's a bit much on my brush there. but we are going to dry brush along the edge of his axe here. Now I'm not too worried if we do end up hitting the black stuff in the center, and that's because we're then going to turn to Blood for the Blood God. Now, this is a wonderful grim paint. I suggest a thoroughly ratty old brush to apply this. We're going to stab this on fairly randomly against the head of the chain axe. And you can splatter a little bit more in anywhere that you miss. Oh, it's awful. Once this is dried, you can come back with a second layer and really make some of those areas look properly grim. Ooh, yucky! Now what I've got is, on the subject of battle damage and gore and grime, a little bit of administratum grey and a ragged old brush. What I'm going to do is sort of stab off most of this paint to the side here, and we're going to start with a lighter colour to get some chipping effect. So I'm going to stipple this lightly along the edge of his leg here, where he's likely to see some damage accumulate. And I'm going to do this over any area where I want some armor chipping. My suggestion is don't go crazy with this though. And you'll see you get a very quick, uneven, ragged chipped effect there. Now anything that works on painting a tank will work on painting a space marine. So I've got some Dawnstone, and I'm going to do a little of this again in the same way on the dark black stuff. Now, there's simply not as much of that dark black, so don't worry too much if you don't find places where it's going to look natural. We're going to move on now, and still with our same brush, we're going to use a little bit of dryad bark and just very lightly jab over some of the areas where we have done our chipping. And you'll see we get a slightly more natural, dinged up armor appearance. There we go. Dinged up, battered power armor, no fuss. Never throw out a brush until it can't do anything. So that's why, these old ones, keep them around. I'm sure you'll find a use. Now I'm going to go back to Gracia, and I am going to very lightly highlight some of the chapter badge and the helmet. And once I've done with that, I'm going to highlight the, the purity seals. But I'll just list the paints for those in the description. You don't really need to see me do that. What I'm going to do then is take this fella outside, and I'm going to hit him with a Munitorum varnish. You can probably tell I'm getting excited because I'm quite close to finished now. And then I'm going to base him up, and we'll get a look at what this dude looks like at last when he is all finished.
And there at last, our space shark is complete. Now, this took a few detours compared to what I thought was going to be a fairly simple Space Marine paint in the first place, and I actually really enjoyed taking the time to get to grips with one or two of the changes that I wanted to make along the way. In particular, I do thoroughly recommend go pick yourself up some German grey from Vallejo, because it's going to make painting black an absolute breeze by comparison. And I really can't stress enough as well that the point of whatever works on painting a tank will work on painting a Space Marine holds true no matter what chapter you're doing. And if you like that really easy battle damage effect, it'll work on any chapter that you can think of. Just use your lightest highlight color for the armor, give it a bit of a stab, and then put some dark brown over the top. Easy as. So thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as the patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred, and Jimmy. Your support is invaluable, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free, drop them in the old box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.